If your business has finally reached the point where it's producing more cash than it immediately needs, you eventually run into a new kind of decision. For a long time, the money inside the business is simply income. It arrives and immediately leaves again. It pays expenses, keeps the system running, and makes the next month possible. But once the machine stabilizes, something changes. Some of the cash stays inside the system. And when that happens, the question shifts from how do I earn more income to something more strategic. What should this money become? That's where the conversation about assets usually begins. The moment your business produces surplus cash, the next question isn't income, it's allocation. I remember the first time that question appeared for me in a serious way. The business had reached a level where the monthly income covered its own operations comfortably. Nothing dramatic had changed overnight, but the system had finally become predictable. For the first time, some money inside the business didn't have an immediate job. That moment sounds small, but it introduces an entirely new kind of decision. Because when cash no longer needs to keep the machine alive, it becomes something else. Capital. And capital eventually asks a different question. What kind of asset should this system start building? Most entrepreneurs answer that question quickly. Too quickly. They assume the first asset should be something external to the business: real estate, investments, other ventures. Those things can absolutely be valuable, but in many cases they appear earlier in the conversation than they should. Because the first asset an entrepreneur needs is usually much closer to the machine that produced the capital in the first place. The first real asset most entrepreneurs should buy is stability inside the income system itself. That idea took me a while to appreciate. In the early stages of building something, growth feels like the obvious direction for every dollar. If the business produces extra cash, the instinct is to expand marketing, hire faster, or launch something new. Movement feels productive. But if the underlying system is still fragile, expansion doesn't actually create an asset. It simply increases activity. An asset is something different. An asset produces value even when you're not constantly pushing the machine forward. When I started paying attention to the systems that lasted the longest, I noticed something interesting. The founders who built durable businesses often used their first surplus capital in ways that made the system calmer rather than bigger. They strengthened infrastructure. They removed dependencies. They created buffers that allowed the business to operate without constant pressure. Those moves rarely look dramatic from the outside, but they fundamentally change the way the system behaves. The first real asset inside a business is resilience. Resilience doesn't show up in the same way revenue does. You won't see it immediately in the numbers, but you feel it in the way the system reacts to uncertainty. When the business has resilience, a slow month doesn't create panic. A temporary disruption doesn't destabilize the entire operation. Decisions become less reactive and more deliberate. That change alone is incredibly powerful. I remember a period when the business had accumulated a modest amount of surplus capital. Earlier in the journey, I would have used that money immediately to expand something. Marketing would have increased. New experiments would have started. Instead, I did something that initially felt almost uncomfortable. I reinforced the system. Part of that meant building financial buffers, so the business could operate calmly even if revenue fluctuated. Another part meant improving processes so fewer decisions required my direct attention. Those changes didn't produce immediate excitement, but they produced something far more valuable. The machine became steadier. An asset is something that reduces the effort required to sustain the system. That definition changed how I thought about capital allocation entirely. Instead of asking how surplus cash could create more activity, the question became how it could reduce fragility. Some investments made the system easier to operate. Others removed bottlenecks that had been quietly limiting growth. And some simply created enough stability that the business no longer needed to react to every short-term fluctuation. Over time, that stability became the foundation for everything else. Once the system was resilient, new opportunities could be evaluated without urgency. Growth decisions became clearer because the business wasn't operating under constant pressure. That's when external assets started making more sense. Real estate, equity investments, acquisitions. But those opportunities were easier to pursue because the original income system had already become a reliable machine. The strongest entrepreneurs don't rush to diversify before their core system becomes an asset. That lesson appears repeatedly across durable businesses. When founders try to build multiple assets before the original machine is truly stable, the result often becomes scattered attention. Each new investment pulls focus away from the system that produced the capital in the first place. But when the core system becomes resilient, diversification happens from a position of strength. The business continues producing income predictably. Capital accumulates steadily, and new assets can be built without destabilizing the original machine. I remember realizing that the business had reached a different phase when decisions started feeling calmer. The system could absorb mistakes without collapsing. Opportunities could be evaluated thoughtfully instead of urgently. That stability created leverage. Not just financial leverage, but mental leverage. The first asset an entrepreneur should build is a system that can survive without constant intervention. Once that exists, the conversation about additional assets becomes much more interesting. Now capital can flow into new structures that expand the ecosystem around the business, rather than compensating for weaknesses inside it. And that's when the system begins evolving into something more than a source of income. It becomes a platform that generates capital, accumulates assets, and gradually builds the kind of long-term leverage that most entrepreneurs are actually chasing, even if they don't realize it when they first start building. Because the real goal was never just income. It was building a machine strong enough to produce assets for the rest of your life.